Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. If we really want to understand the incredibly fragile state of Middle Eastern geopolitics right now, we have to look at a massive central paradox in the Yemen conflict. For years, the international community has been absolutely terrified of the Yemen truce breaking. But here's the objective, undeniable reality. The truce that everyone is so worried about shattering, it actually expired back on October 2nd, 2022. So today, we're going to unpack exactly what ended during that first week of August 2026. And to do that, we really need to look at what was actually holding the country together in the first place.
It's kind of wild when you think about it. The official UN-brokered truce only lasted from April to October of 2022. It got renewed twice, and then, well, the parties just declined an extension. The paper was literally stamped lapsed. Yet, despite that, the front lines went quiet, and they stayed quiet. What that means is, for 4 whole years, the most consequential arrangement keeping Yemen from total war wasn't a treaty at all. It was just an unwritten expectation. Every single morning, both sides woke up and made this mutual, unspoken decision that neither of them would move first. The line on the map completely outlived the paper it was drawn on. Now look at the structural difference here because it's absolutely crucial. Think about a treaty. A treaty breaks when someone violates a specific written clause, right? You have a text, you have international monitors on the ground, you have a formal breach. But a habit just ends. It ends the very second one side privately calculates that waiting around has become more dangerous than making a move. There's no formal violation to report because, well, there's nothing written down to violate in the first place. Middle East specialist Elizabeth Kendall really hits the nail on the head in the documentary sources we're looking at. She points out that because the civil war never technically ended, a full-scale conflict could just resume at any moment. The structural implications of this are staggering. Because there's no legal instrument holding the peace together, there are basically no legal breaks to stop a sudden return to all-out war. So that brings us to the strategic geography of Marib, which happens to be exactly where this recent escalation erupted. If we look back between 2020 and 2022, a major offensive pushed tens of thousands of civilians out of their homes, and it only stopped just short of the city limits right as that 2022 truce kicked in. We have to remember, this isn't just empty desert we're talking about. This recent history is the memory sitting right underneath everything happening on the ground today. You might be wondering, why does this specific patch of ground matter so much right now? Well, Marib holds Yemen's vital oil and gas infrastructure. It's the primary domestic source of cooking gas for the entire country. So it's a utility, not just a military stronghold. Plus, and this is massive, it currently shelters over 2 million displaced Yemenis. That is nearly half of the country's entire displaced population sitting right in the crosshairs.
Researcher Adel Dashela makes a really sobering point here. Because of the history we just went over, nobody in Yemen looks at an exchange of fire near Marib and thinks, oh, that's just an isolated incident. No way. They read it as chapter 2 of a life and death battle. It is the absolute focal point of the conflict. Any spark here has the very real potential to ignite the entire region. Which brings us to the events of August 6, 2026. Government military camps in Hadramout and Marib were suddenly attacked. Afterwards, Houthi military spokesman Yahya Saree issued a very specific justification. He stated that they had detected a massive Saudi military mobilization. Now, notice the crucial caveat they highlighted here. This claim has not been independently verified. In this explainer, we are strictly looking at the stated justification, not an established fact.
But here's the thing. That statement introduces a terrifying structural shift. Think about it. For 4 years, the old rule of the habit was retaliation. You wait for an action, and then you respond. But Saree's statement introduces a totally new rule, preemption. The stated doctrine has shifted to taking preemptive action based purely on an internal assessment, or basically a suspicion, of what the other side might be planning to do. And when you look at the targets of those August 6th attacks, they fit this new preemptive logic perfectly. They specifically struck the Homeland Shield Forces. Now, this is a Saudi-backed group created back in 2022. They're tens of thousands strong, and they guard the Marib-Hadramout frontier. Theoretically, this is the exact force that would lead any ground offensive. By striking them first, this whole preemption doctrine is being put into physical practice. Now, in the fog of conflict, we have to be incredibly strict about attributing claims. Take a look at the casualty reports from August 6. They are all over the place. The Yemen government claims 30 killed. The Houthi account says 45. And the Houthi spokesman? He claims hundreds of casualties. As you can see, none of these 3 wildly different figures have been verified by any independent body. So while the human cost is fiercely contested, the structural shift in how the war is being fought is undeniable. And things just snowballed so incredibly fast. Literally over just 3 days, the escalation cascaded. We have the preemptive strikes on August 6th. The very next day, August 7, there are reported strikes on residential areas right inside Marib city. And then, by August 8, the government announces a multi-access counteroffensive. In just 72 hours, 4 whole years of quiet completely shattered. This slide right here brilliantly captures what we call the fog of escalation. Look at how completely polarized these internal narratives are. On one side, the government and the Saudi coalition view the initial acts as completely unprovoked terrorism. On the other side, the Houthis describe those exact same acts as strictly defensive preemption against a planned offensive. Each side views their own actions as purely defensive, while looking at the exact same events as undeniable proof of the other side's aggression. So how does a frozen front line suddenly melt into a war? It's this loop right here. This is how preemption acts as a mechanism for conflict. It creates this vicious, self-fulfilling cycle. Side A acts on a suspicion. Side B obviously responds to that action. But then Side A looks at Side B's response and says, aha, see? I knew you were preparing to attack. The response literally validates the initial suspicion, and the loop just spins faster and faster, completely out of control. This rapid destabilization and the closing of that loop we just talked about prompted a really urgent warning from UN Special Envoy Hans Grundberg. Speaking from Amman, he stated plainly that the risk of a large-scale conflict is at its absolute highest point since the UN-brokered Truce of 2022. And notice the yardstick he's using there, the Truce. The very document that expired years ago is somehow still the baseline for stability in the region. And Grundberg wasn't just talking about the ground game. He laid out a whole list of alarming, interconnected warning signs. He directly tied the domestic attacks in Marib and Hadramout to broader regional tensions, specifically pointing out the commercial shipping strikes in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, along with strikes on civilian airports. Basically, this local havoc breaking apart is now jeopardizing the entire region. To figure out how this might actually blow up into a wider conflict, let's look back at Elizabeth Kendall's analysis from our sources. She notes a critical shift on the ground. Yemeni government forces are currently way more unified than they've been in previous years. Now, this unification could heavily tip the scales, but it comes with a massive caveat. It really only works in their favor if Saudi Arabia decides to intervene decisively, which makes Saudi Arabia the absolute most crucial gear in this whole geopolitical machine. See, since the 2022 truce, their posture has been strictly one of containment. They favored limited, measured responses rather than a forceful, full-scale military intervention. But if that posture changes based on these new escalations, we immediately shift from a localized civil conflict straight back into a full-blown regional war. Amin Nagy, over at the International Crisis Group, brings up a really scary point about the mechanics here. He warns that this specific pattern of cross-border escalation essentially destroys the brakes on the conflict. Because it's driven entirely by preemption and suspicion, all those traditional off-ramps just disappear. It makes any hope for de-escalation incredibly difficult because the machine is practically moving on its own. As we wrap up this explainer, we really need to cut through the noise. We have to separate what is reasonably established from what's just being claimed. So what is established? The attacks and responses from August 6 to 8. What is contested? The casualty numbers and the actual reality of that detected Saudi mobilization. And what are the independent findings? The UN stating this is the highest risk of war since 2022. Keeping these columns separate in your mind is absolutely vital for objective analysis. Ultimately, the biggest takeaway here is that nobody had to tear up a physical treaty for this peace to shatter. It was just a silent agreement, a habit, renewed every single morning by people who never signed anything, until one day they simply decided that waiting was too dangerous. And that leaves us with one pretty haunting question moving forward. If the ceasefire was only ever a daily habit, what is actually left to break?